did the apostles use the Septuagint as their Bible? Well, what exactly is the Septuagint? The Septuagint, long story short, just painting with broad strokes here, is not a standardized text. It's not like there's just one edition, one standard edition. Well, maybe these days you kind of have a standard edition with a critical apparatus, but historically there wasn't this kind of standardized process of the Septuagint, despite some legendary tales otherwise. It was more just a group of Greek translations of the Hebrew Old Testament. Again, there are some legendary accounts that, Ptolemy locked a whole bunch of people, 70 scholars in a group, and they all came out with the exact same translation. All 70 of them came out with the exact same Greek translation. It's a miracle, and that's the Septuagint, hence the name Septuagint, which means 70. Most scholars recognize that legendary account is probably not accurate, and it appears that there wasn't just this one period in time where there was this standard translation. It was something that took centuries, and you just have a whole group of Greek translations of the Hebrew Old Testament, and kind of putting those together is what we now call the Septuagint. So it's not a standardized text, and there's certainly not, a consistent reading among all of the Septuagint manuscripts that we have today, which is why we have critical editions of the Septuagint, much like we do the New Testament. So the Septuagint Greek translation, roughly beginning in the 3rd century BC, and arguably going on for several centuries later, as far as the process of these groups of manuscripts that we have now being translated. That's as opposed to, for example, the Masoretic text. You may have heard of the Masoretes. These are a group of Jewish scribes later on, beginning in the 6th century AD and on into the 10th and 11th century, standardizing the Hebrew text as opposed to the Greek translation. And, it's not that the Masoretic text and its peculiar readings began in the 6th century AD. You have proto-Masoretic text type readings going back as far as the Dead Sea Scrolls several centuries before Jesus. And so you kind of have those proto-Masoretic readings that become codified and incorporated into what we later call the Masoretic text tradition. But that's going to be a Hebrew text of the Old Testament as opposed to a translation like the Septuagint. And believe it or not, these are not the only different kinds of families, of textual families that we have for the Old Testament. There are some peculiar readings that are native just to the Dead Sea Scrolls several centuries before Jesus that don't line up with the Masoretic text and don't line up with the Septuagint. Then we have what's called non-aligned texts that don't line up with readings from the Dead Sea Scrolls. They don't line up with readings from the Septuagint. They don't line up with readings from the Masoretic texts. They don't line up with readings from some of the Old Testament texts that we find in the New Testament when the New Testament quotes the Old Testament. They don't line up with anything we've ever seen before. And believe it or not, it's not that like there's just a few of these things in the Dead Sea Scrolls. A great amount of the texts that we discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls are non-aligned texts, which tells us the further back we go in time, the more diverse the textual readings were, the more different our Old Testament readings were. Creating a nightmare for scholars in attempting to reconstruct the text of the Old Testament. We'll talk a little bit more about here in a moment, because I think there's a difficulty here for everyone all around, but especially Cliff, who would hold the Sola Scriptura. Okay, so the statement there, the Septuagint was the Bible, the Old Testament that the apostles used. Maybe there's a little bit more than a grain of truth to that, but that's not entirely accurate. So whenever you find the New Testament quoting the Old Testament, a lot of people are under the impression that it's always quoting some kind of Septuagint reading. That's not accurate. In reality, it's estimated somewhere between 60 and 70% of the Old Testament quotations in the New Testament are Septuagint readings, 60 to 70%. So you could say the majority of the time they're quoting the Septuagint, but not all the time. And it wasn't that they were necessarily committed to the Septuagint as opposed to some other translation or Hebrew text. It was just a lot more accessible since they're writing in Greek in the New Testament, a lot more accessible to use a Greek translation of the Old Testament text. So you do see an emphasis on the Septuagint, but that wasn't necessarily their Bible.
Hey, I hope you're enjoying the video so far. I just want to remind you, hit the subscribe button and the like button. Also consider supporting the channel at patreon.com/reason and theology, or just hit the join button to become a channel member right here on YouTube. Okay, let's get back to the video.
Because the New Testament does quote the Masoretic text in the readings that become incorporated into the Masoretic text tradition. So that are aligned with that stream. And the New Testament quotes it 15 to 20% of the time. So it's not like the apostles were against the use of the Masoretic text. They had a blend between the two. The apostles used both. They just heavily used the Septuagint, again, likely because the New Testament's written in Greek. However, there is an estimated 10 to 20% of the Old Testament's quotes in the New Testament that don't line up with either. So sometimes when the apostles quoted the Old Testament, it doesn't line up with anything in the Septuagint or the Masoretic text. In fact, it lines up with nothing we've ever seen before. There's no manuscript witnesses. There are no manuscripts that we could put our hands on that lines up with what the apostles quoted. So that creates a lot of difficulties and challenges. So you have these non-aligned texts that sometimes they're citing. So it's not that clear cut that they just use the Septuagint. Now, why do I think that the Eastern Orthodox here is maybe attempting to use that claim about the Septuagint? If I had to guess, just based on the conversation here, I suspect maybe the attempt is to argue that, well, if they're using in the New Testament, if they're using the Septuagint, they would then consider the canon that we find in the Septuagint to be authoritative. What is the canon? The canon is which books belong in the Bible. So if we're talking about the Old Testament canon, we're talking about which books belong to the Old Testament. Now, admittedly, if you look at complete copies of the Septuagint that we have today, they include the deuterocanonical books. These are books of the Old Testament that Jews and also Protestants don't have in their canon. So there's about 7 of these books, sometimes a little bit more, that Protestants and Jews don't have in their Old Testament, but Catholics and Eastern Orthodox do. And there is some differences also in the canon here with Catholics and Orthodox. Okay, but there are some extra books there, right, in the Septuagint. And I think the idea is, well, if the apostles are quoting the Septuagint, they're then accepting the canon that we find in these Septuagint books, which would mean that the Deuterocanonicals are part of the canon, and the Protestants were wrong to take them out. I think that's the line of reasoning. The difficulty here, however, is, if you look at the complete copies that we have of the Septuagint that shows that we have those books in the canon, the Deuterocanonicals, the books that the Protestants don't have, but Catholics and Orthodox do. If you look at them, they're in the great unsealed texts. These are Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, Alexandrinus, and Ephraemi Rescriptus, I think. So you have these great unsealed texts, right? But they're from the 4th century AD, and they're Christian texts. So when you look at the canon, when you look at the books that are in those editions of the Old Testament, in the Septuagint, this is something in the 4th century after the time of Jesus, right? And they are Christian Bibles, Christian texts. That doesn't really tell us anything about the Septuagint prior to these unseals. and which books were included in different editions of the Septuagint prior to these unseals, let alone prior to the time of Jesus. So say that you're living in 200 BC in Alexandria, Egypt, and let's say you had a complete copy of the Septuagint. Would it have contained the Deuterocanonicals? We don't know. You can't say, well, because these 4th century Christian editions of the Bible had them, therefore the 2nd century BC Alexandrian ones would have had it. Maybe they did. Maybe they would have. Maybe they didn't. We don't know, because we don't have any copies, complete copies of the Septuagint prior to these great unsealed texts in the 4th century AD. We have some fragments of the Septuagint here and there, but they're fragments. They are not complete editions. You want to find the first complete edition, complete copy, you're going to have to go to the 4th century. And that's true of some New Testament books as well. If you're going to look for like complete copies of some New Testament books, in some cases we have fragments. In other cases, if you want a complete copy, you got to go to the 4th century before you have a complete copy of the New Testament or a particular book of the New Testament. So we can't just simply say, hey, they use the Septuagint, ergo Deuterocanonicals are part of the canon. It's not that simple, because a skeptic could just say, well, number one, they didn't always quote the Septuagint. Sometimes they quoted the Masoretic text tradition, and the Masoretic text tradition doesn't seem to incorporate those deuterocanonical books. But number two, what we know about the Septuagint as far as a complete edition with its canon is coming from the 4th century, centuries later, after Jesus, and is obviously coming from Christian communities, not Jewish ones, and not even necessarily Christian communities in the 1st century, for example. So that's why it's maybe not necessarily kind of a slam dunk. It's something to maybe just be aware of. That's not to say that the Deuterocanonicals are not canonical. That's not to say that. But what it is to say is we can't necessarily just appeal to that fact alone to establish the canon. We have to appeal to other things to establish the canon. And we'll talk about what they are here in a moment.
Thanks so much for watching. Make sure to subscribe. And for a deeper dive, check out my courses at rtcourses.com and my Patreon channel at patreon.com/Reason and Theology.